presentation. Please submit all your questions in the Q&A tool, and you can do this with your name. In this case, I will call upon you to ask the question in person. You can do it also anonymously. We would like to encourage all our PhD students and postdoctoral students to participate actively in the discussion, and we will give priority to your questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A tool. We introduced today a new technical innovation. So you all see this raise hand tool on the bottom of your screen. So with this tool, you basically have the opportunity, if you have a clarifying question during the presentation, and you think that you should interrupt the speaker to clarify a point or a technical aspect of the presentation, please click on the raise hand tool. In this case, I will call upon your name and you will ask your question. Just to clarify, you won't be able to type your clarifying question. So you just raise your hand and I will call you, and then Jenny will be, she will address your clarifying question. So with this, it is my greatest pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jenny Trinitapoli. Jenny is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Texas in Austin. Her training is in two main areas, social demography and the sociology of religion. She has written extensively on the role of religion during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Jenny has been the principal investigator of several NIH-funded research projects, and I want to mention just one of her projects. So since 2008, she has been the principal investigator of the Tugolo Latansi, or the TOT project in Malawi. This is a longitudinal study of young adults in Malawi. The project focuses on investigating how young adults negotiate relationships, sex, and childbearing during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Malawi. The TOT project is supported through grants from the National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development. Jenny has also received numerous honors and awards. Just to mention a few, in 2016, she received the Faculty Award for Facebook Research from the University of Chicago. In 2013, she received a Penn State University, the Penn State Roy Buck Award for Outstanding Publication in the Social Sciences by a junior faculty member for her work on uncertainty and fertility in generalized AIDS epidemic. She is a board member of the Population Association of America. She serves as a deputy editor of demographic research, and she's also currently a director of the Center for International Social Science Research at the University of Chicago. And Jenny was or is also editorial board member of Demography, Sociology of Religion, and the American Journal of Sociology. So Jenny, thank you very much for presenting at the PSC Colloquium. Please welcome Jenny, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ileana. That's a great and very, very kind introduction. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for attending. I was so nervous I couldn't sleep last night, in part because this is, UPenn demography, and also in part because it's new material from a in-progress book project that is tentatively called An Epidemic of Uncertainty. And I'm going to talk about one specific empirical chapter about relationship uncertainty, which is related to marriage, the marriage process, and also HIV risk in a young population of young adults in Balaka. This is all from the Tugolo Latansi project, which is a joint collaboration with Sarah Yateman, and I'll talk about some of the other collaborators as the talk goes on. But the monograph, I'm gonna try to situate the information from this chapter in the broader scope of the book. And the overall goals of the monograph are really trying to emphasize is first to make an empirical argument that says, in understanding HIV, we need to think about it as an epidemic of uncertainty. The theoretical ambition of that book is a little bit broader than just the case of HIV, and it's trying to center uncertainty, which we sort of usually think about at the margins of a topic of research, and try to make that actually the object of inquiry into social life, specifically in the context of the generalized AIDS epidemic. And then a third ambition of the book, and I might be preaching to the choir here in terms of trying to give like a plea to for more demography period and more demographic research on HIV and related social transformations. But I guess the observation is trying to communicate to a broader audience the strength and the values of using population tools and a population perspective for understanding the world. That is not just for understanding demographic phenomena, but understanding social phenomena that sometimes fall outside fertility, mortality, migration, even if we include health and aging, things that are a little bit even further outside that. And in some ways, I'll underscore this when I review some of the literature that I think that I'm grounded in. As a discipline, we are excellent at doing very, very, very careful research on our topics. We have a relentless pursuit of data quality and careful measurement. We are not always the best at engaging with other parts of other disciplines and folks outside of the demographic audiences and journals. And so in trying to write this research for an audience that is in sociology, perhaps in global health, moving just outside of the demography journals, I'm trying to explore the value of a population perspective. So thinking about the HIV epidemic, and this gives you a sense of how the book is structured, I'm trying to make an argument that in order to understand it, specifically the case in Malawi, we need to think about the demographic contours of HIV using demographic tools. We need to think about AIDS-related uncertainty, but I'm also trying to tie that into other different types of uncertainty that people experience in their lives. Relationship uncertainty, livelihood uncertainty, and then existential uncertainty, which is a little bit more tied to some of my interests in the sociology of religion. What I'm going to focus on today in the material that I present is relationship uncertainty. This is the empirical piece that I'm working on right now. So I want to introduce the TLT study to everyone. And thank you, Ileana, for saying so much already about the funders that we have to be appreciative for. I'm going to talk about the patterning of HIV in this population using some examples of standardization and decomposition. I'm going to talk about population chatter, which is a theme that I'm trying to weave throughout the entirety of the manuscript. I'm going to use an example of a newspaper clipping and then like long-ish ethnographic excerpt, women chatting at the hair salon about some of the things going on in their lives. In this population chatter section, you're going to see a few very different and very strong influences on my research. The first and very obvious one, especially for you Penn folks, is going to be the influence of Susan Watkins on this work. Not just Susan's work with ethnographic journals in Malawi, but also her historical work, which really focused on the importance of gossip for understanding the fertility transitions across Europe in a historical perspective. There are two different distinctions from the way that I'm approaching this notion of population chatter and the work that Susan's already done with the journals and with her book with Anne Swidler. One of them is that the population chatter sort of umbrella is a little bit larger than just focusing on HIV, which has been the purpose of that work. And second, Susan Watkins' work is this really multivocal collection of conversations about HIV in Malawi over a very long period of time. I think that they've covered like 25 years of, they have 25 years of journals going back to the early 1990s. The examples of population chatter that I'm going to offer include the ethnographic perspective of one research assistant, Gertrude Finyiza, who is happy to be named and acknowledged as a collaborator in this. So this is from the conversational bits come from one young woman's perspective as the ethnographer. And the other distinction is that I'm also trying to combine it a little bit more with news, for example, news sources, radio messages, and the gray literature from NGOs that sometimes circulate. There's a third influence on this notion of population chatter, which comes from some work that I encountered in the last couple of years by Tamotsu Shibutani, who wrote a book called Improvised News. It was published in 1965, but he collected all of this data starting in the early 1940s around the Second World War. And he really writes a lot. I mean, I think the earlier work that Susan has done in particular is focusing on how people figure out what HIV is about, how they assess risk, and how they understand that. And this perspective on rumors as improvised news from Shibutani has some very interesting notes for us, I think, in trying to understand the way that like this data as population chatter could work. Not necessarily thinking about it as information, but as cultural reinforcement. In his study, he did this. He collected rumors. A lot of them were about the war, about the Second World War. A lot of them were about the treatment of prisoners of political prisoners in a variety of different situations, including Japanese internment camps in the United States. And he did this really in-depth study of 225 rumors, and including trying to trace their origins and how they were resolved in a variety of communities. And he found that only 12 of them were inconsistent with the cultural norms. And so this idea of population chatter is about like hearing what people are saying about population related issues in their everyday life, and also trying to figure out like how this is part of cultural reinforcement, or what this tells us about the about the broader context. I'm also going to show a small mini demographic analysis of relationship uncertainty, an example of how we make that uncertainty the object of our study, or how we could do it. And then finally, I'm going to end with like another long-ish ethnographic excerpt that I hope serves as the bridge to like what I plan to have as the next chapter. Again, all of this is like preliminary and in progress, but this is like my plan, how I'm coming at the material for you. So to help get you situated at where we are in Balaka, Malawi, this is the high fertility context with a high and fairly stable HIV epidemic. HIV prevalence in Balaka specifically is about 12% of all adults right now. This is also a context of rapid population growth and a lot of migration and mobility. You can see where Balaka is situated within Malawi and that within sub-Saharan Africa. And so the TLT project started as a collaboration with Sarah Yateman. In the course of designing this project, we got great advice from Susan Watkins, from Hans-Peter Kohler, from Jerry Behrman. So thank you all for weighing in on this. We've had excellent collaborators at KCN in Malawi and Chancellor College in Malawi throughout the project, both faculty and student collaborators, as we've worked for over 10 years on this project. But the project started, it was designed in 2008, began in 2009 in terms of data collection, And sort of unlike the demographic and health surveys, which try to provide, nationally representative sample covering the entire reproductive age range, and also in some ways distinct from what was the MDICP, now the MLSFH, which works in 3 different districts of Malawi and is therefore really able to make comparisons between cultural and demographic contexts, where there are different social arrangements in the northern region compared to the southern region and the central region. This is really a highly contextualized approach, where we're looking at dynamics in a single community very closely at small intervals over a long period of time. The beginning of the study had this intensive approach. We collected 9 waves of data at 4-month intervals over this period of 3 years, using a catchment area that was about a 7-kilometer radius around the main market in Balaka town. This is a pretty massive study. We enrolled 1,500 women at the get-go. And once enrolled in the study, and we also enrolled a sample of 600 men. These were women ages 15 to 25, and also young men 15 to 25. An important part of our study was that once the women were enrolled in the study, they answered questions about their sexual and their romantic relationships, and they were given tokens to pass on to their male partners. So we also enrolled not a random sample of men, but a systematically coordinated sample of male partners in the study. And we reached about 850 male partners during the 3 years. The enrollment for the male partners was ongoing for the first 3 years of the study. This was run and supported by a staff of about 60 people, including supervisors, enumerators, and interviewers, data entry clerks, a gardener, a watchman, cleaners, and a granny to help wrangle babies and toddlers that were coming in and out of the research center on a daily basis. Because if you're running a fertility study, you need to give the women a little bit of help with their children while they're answering your questions. So this gives you a sense of what the TLT project looks like. And in thinking about this over time, and it was designed around this first phase of the study to interview these women during the 3-year period. We renewed the project after a major policy intervention changed the way that antiretroviral drugs were being distributed in this context. And that allowed us to collect a new, to do a follow-up study that wasn't necessarily planned, that wasn't planned in the first place in 2015. And in the 2015 round of survey, we followed all the women and men that were at the study from the beginning, and and we also followed male partners, but we only interviewed the partners that were still with. We interviewed women's male partners in 2015, but not their old partners. In 2019, thanks to funding through the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, Emily Smith Greenaway received an award that helped perpetuate our data collection even longer. And this is under, yet again, a new or a different kind of policy regime, which is the beginning of universal test and treat in Malawi, or a less stringent rationing of antiretroviral drugs. And the design of the study, I mean, demographers are going to be familiar with this sort of like Lexis type layout, is where the sample is really being followed. Basically, we can see what's going on in these women's lives and also in the men's, starting them between the ages of 15 and 25 and getting them up to the ages of 25 to 35 by 2019 when we last interviewed them. Another thing that we did in the design specifically for the 2019 data collection is we included a refresher sample, and we expanded the age range of the refresher sample so that we could think a little bit more about what's changed for 21 to 25-year-olds at these different periods of time. Like I said, when we first designed the study, we had the intention of following this group for 3 years, and I wasn't necessarily thinking in 10-year increments at that time. So basically being able to make comparisons between the reality for 21 to 25-year-old women, even though that's not like a totally traditional demographic age group, we usually go 20 to 24, right? But that is how you can sort of see how that is feasible, or how those kinds of analyses can happen with the data that we have. So there are, with moving towards the substance of relationship uncertainty, there are really important key things that we know about marriage and HIV in and around Malawi. And almost all of this comes from, this slide is like a parade of citations of UPenn folks from, Hans Peter's work, Jerry's work, also recent work by Sophia Che and Teresa Fedor, and then an earlier generation of Penn students, including Nancy Luke and Shelley Clark, and the insights that they've produced. So we really know a lot about marriage dynamics around HIV in this part of the world, from Malawi and specifically. And one of the reasons we know so much about Malawi is because the MDICP collected good data on marriage at a time when the demographic and health surveys hadn't begun to do that. Really, they've only been collecting data on marital status. So from this rich data that we have on Malawi, there are things that we know about the risk factors for young adults, and some of this is contested. There are a lot of things that look clear in cross-sectional studies that, once examined more thoroughly from a demographic perspective, will sort of like change the way that we think about them. So I'm going to give like 3 quick examples of this. The first is a clear relationship between age at first sex and HIV risk, right? Where early sexual debut is thought of as risky and positively associated with being HIV positive for young women. And we've seen a correction to that by work that shows that it's really important to have a life course perspective on this. It's really important to understand the length of time between sexual debut and first marriage. It's really important to think about whether sexual debut is with the first person of the first marriage. And this comes from the Boileau paper that I've cited up here. That's the difference between a life course perspective and the interpretation we get from the cross-sectional approach is a really important change in how we understand this. There have been other debates where demographic phenomena or demographic approach has really corrected how we understand the nature of sexual relationships. And I think that work that Nancy Luke, Michelle Poulin, and Sanyu Mojola have all done in this is very, very important. A lot of what has been characterized as transactional sex in sub-Saharan Africa is not actually transactional sex as we would think of it in terms of it's not sex work. It is capturing something about the semiotics of support and like meaning in relationships and what constitutes a relationship. I'm going to skip over I'm not going to go into the details for all of this, but I'm going to give another set of examples about about what we understand about divorce and the importance of understanding divorce in this context. Work specifically advanced by Georges Renier shows that about 50% of first marriages in Malawi end in divorce within, I think it's the first 7 years. And there's reason to believe that HIV positive individuals are at increased risk of divorce, right? That marital dissolution is more likely for HIV positive couples. But there are also important questions and corrections about, are we really thinking about, that have been made in this literature, are we really thinking about the person's HIV status? How do we disentangle that from learning your HIV results? And looked at more closely, the work by Fedor and colleagues shows that actually HIV positive folks are more likely to stay married under some circumstances. And work by Phil and Glevich has showed very clearly that most of the literature has been pretty confused about the relationships and like the order of marriage, migration, and HIV and how these are intertwined. And because he had such careful data, he was able to untangle that and show that HIV infections are not primarily the cause of a migration. They actually, most of them happened, it's that HIV positive individuals are more likely to migrate in many contexts. So this gives you some example of like why the demographic approach has been valuable in providing improvements over like what was understood from cross-sectional analyses. I'm going to use this slide to talk a little bit about HIV prevalence and by age and sex. And this comes from the demographic and health surveys. And this is in Malawi. And we can see the curve both for women and for men here. We can see that, trying to explain a little bit more about why we decided to focus so carefully on adolescence and early adulthood is that not all, but most HIV infections in this context happen by age 35 or age 30 to 35. The steepest, the childbearing years and the years of marriage are the years of, are the steepest years for the rise in HIV prevalence understood cross-sectionally in a population. I'd also like to point out something in this slide about the gender nature of the epidemic, and that is that that there's a clear gap between male HIV prevalence and female HIV prevalence, but it starts to close at the older ages. So women are not just, it's not that women are, it's that only women are affected, they are affected earlier and at earlier ages. So I'm going to turn to the data that we collected, the HIV prevalence data that we collected from the TLT study. We got biomarker data from the women really throughout the entirety of the period. So we're able to estimate prevalence and specifically age-specific prevalence over 4 different points in time. Here's what the age gradient looks like in 2009 when we first began the study from age 15-year-olds. Very few 15-year-olds were infected, but at 25-year-olds, it was much higher, 11 to 12%, and this was about 6% HIV prevalence among these women when we first began the study. In 2011, HIV prevalence had gone up in the study overall, but the gradient flattened out a little bit. The gradient was declined a little bit, and we saw something similar in 2015 and when we went to do the follow-up for women. In 2015, HIV prevalence, however, in this group was at 15%. So it had risen from 6% in 2009 to 15% in 2015. By 2019, prevalence overall was 16%, so it didn't go up a lot after 2016. But but we see here that the age gradient really changes even more. Thinking about marriage, why make marriage rather than age the central question here. This is the period of the life course in which most in Malawi specifically, and in Balaka, this is from household listing data, people transition to being married. And if you can look at it, the detailed view of young adulthood in single years, by age 25, it's 80% of women who are married compared to just a few at age 15. And so marriage is a huge part of the process. It unfolds very quickly and it's almost universal. Again, thinking about our data in the long period of in the way that our sample ages is important, but we also want to take a age standardized view and think about how do things change for just the 21 to 25-year-olds that we can observe consistently throughout the throughout this period. It's not just that a lot of women get married, as I mentioned about from George's research. Divorces are common, and so are remarriages. And so when we look about how, if you want to look at the screen here from 2009 going down to 2019, this is showing you on the left the data of from all TLT women and their marital status, not just whether they're married, whether they're never married, in a first marriage, divorced but not yet remarried, or in a second or third marriage. We can see how much the sample shifts over this period of time, from about 50% married to very few, less than 10% never married, but also how many people are no longer in a first marriage, but how the proportion of people who have been divorced or are now in a second or third marriage is how that increases over time. When we look at this between just for 21 to 25-year-old, and this isn't a true way of standardizing, this is basically just like truncate your sample to make sure to make it the same, like to force it to be a comparison of a small age group. We see actually that there's not a lot of that women of this age are not increasingly more likely to be divorced or married in a second or third time. That we see something pretty similar over those periods of time. So this is my attempt to. So this is something that I could definitely like use feedback on, thinking about what it means to take a population-centered approach where we would use tools like standardization and decomposition to say, you know, how much of the increase of HIV prevalence from 6% to 16% is attributable to these marriage transitions, not just like from never married to first marriage, not necessarily number of sexual partners, but how the marriage, how marital experience, especially in a context of high stability, unfolds. So the approach is really similar to what we would do with age standardization. Instead of calculating like age-specific prevalence rates or we would calculate marital experience-specific prevalence rate. And in this group, there are 5. You can see that in 2009, HIV prevalence is very low for never married women. It goes up when women are in their first marriage. And then when looking at women who are divorced or in a second marriage, it really skyrockets, right? That's the big distinction that we see in terms of HIV prevalence. That pattern is similar in 2012. In 2015 and then into 2019, we see something very different, which is that the never married women are actually have higher levels of HIV prevalence than the women who are in a first marriage. And so I'm trying to think of, and when you look at this for just the age standardized group, I see I don't like some of these confidence intervals either, and so I don't want to make too much of the people who are in the second and the third marriages. But in the standardized sample, we actually see a reduction in HIV prevalence among 21 to 25-year-old women for this period of time, and we also see that. That protective this protective dip in a first marriage holds in the age standardized sample. For men, we don't see that same kind of protective piece in a first marriage, but we see a very similar gradient in terms of marital experience. And that gradient is much steeper than it is for age, showing us that we really need to be focusing on this. This is an area to focus on for understanding the epidemic. So from here, I've tried to do some simple decomposition of rates. Again, trying to just take a marriage-specific HIV prevalence and ask ourselves, if we're trying to think about the increase in HIV prevalence from 2009 to 2015, 7% to 15% in this sample. Oh yeah, I forgot how I rounded. It wasn't 6, it was more like 7. We have an 8-point difference. And among women, we see that for about 45% of it is due to changes in marriage composition. That is like how the sample moves through these different locations on in terms of marital experience. And about 55% of it is due to the rates. Male HIV prevalence, again, as I forgot to point this out, male HIV prevalence increases. It goes from 6% to 10%. It's not as high, it doesn't get to 16% as high as women, but among the male partners, the prevalence is also almost doubling over this period of time. We have a 4-point difference, and when we decompose it, there's something very distinctive for men, which is 85% of it is due to the marriage composition, and only 15% of it is due to the HIV rates that affect the HIV rates that are applied to each sort of marital state, if we think about these as increments or as changing over time. And to me, I don't really think that we often think about decomposition in relation to social theory. But if we're thinking about the gendered nature of the epidemic, and we're thinking, for example, about the idea of agency, and let's imagine a world in which every marriage was a choice that was, that was an individual's autonomous choice, and it was not forced, or there weren't that wasn't forced. Let's imagine the same of every divorce, and then every second, third marriage. One of the things that this shows is that about half of women's risk is really coming from the rates, right? The environment that surrounds them, rather than the marital composition. For men, on the other hand, the way that almost all of the infections that we see among men are explained by 85% is a lot, right? Through their positions in a marital life course. I'm going to change keys a little bit and move into this notion of population chatter. Oh, and I want to say on this decomposition of rates, one thing that would be helpful for me to hear from people is, whether this is too far of a stretch of what we do with decomposition, or whether it makes sense to you, right? This transformation of age to a marriage specific approach. So transitioning to population chatter, I'm going to offer an example from a newspaper clipping where on the front page of a paper in 2015, talking about how a chief was annoyed by so many prevalent early pregnancies, specifically among teenagers. And the article goes on to talk about a major program that was implemented in a few districts in Malawi, a results-based financing program that gave women incentives to deliver in the hospital and go for antenatal care. And this RBF program is a really big, was the source of a lot of conversation in the community. Some of it was about clarifying what the program is, but understanding how and why and which women would receive money when going to the hospital. This doesn't exactly have to do with marriage, but it shows that it shows some of the ways in which fertility concerns and ideas about reproduction are part of the public discourse. And it's tied to an ethnographic vignette that I would like to share from a hair salon. So you can see this is the view of the main market in Balaka, and up close, this is a stock photo of a market, of a hair salon. And the cast of characters in this story are Gertrude, who you've heard of. This is the ethnographer. Enid, the owner of a kiosk salon in the market. She has a small child. There are sort of 5 people to keep track of in the story. Gertrude, Enid, the owner, Rose, who is 4 months pregnant by a man that she is serious with but not formally married to, so we get into marriage here. There's an unnamed teenage girl with a newborn child, and then Natalie, Gertrude's closest friend, who is extremely savvy with men. And I'll leave it at that as the story unfolds. And I'll also say before I read this that there are a few parts of this story. Parts of the story are relevant to relationships, and then there are parts of the story that are relevant to other kinds of uncertainty that are being explored in the other chapter, but we're just going to stay focused on the relationships parts. Gertrude says, I just passed by to say hi to Enid at the salon, and I found her there with Rose and Natalie. I joined them to chat, and they said, Gertrude, let's change your hairstyle now. You've stayed for a month now without changing. And I said, no problem, girls. And they helped each other braid my hair again. A lot of the best conversations come from the hair salon, this salon in particular. Rose had to leave for an antenatal check at Mponda Clinic just up the road. I'll pass by after the clinic so that we can all walk home together, she said. A few minutes after Rose left, the man who was in a relationship with Natalie came to bring her some lunch. He brought 2 packets of biscuits and 2 bottles of juice. He also gave her 2,000 kwacha, and she said she would use it over the weekend, but he said he didn't have time to chat. He left, but Natalie didn't escort him. I asked, why are you not escorting him? And she said, I'm afraid his wife will see me. She and I quarreled once, and I don't want that to happen again. So the wife knows he's cheating on her. Yes, she knows. She doesn't like it, but she knows. How did she come to find out? It's a long story. I'll tell you some other time. Not 30 minutes later, Rose came back from antenatal with a new RBF card in her hand. The clinic had no lines, so her visit didn't take long. I received this card at the hospital. The nurse said it's about maternal health. They want to encourage people to give birth at the hospital, not at home, because when you give birth at home, you can lose a lot of blood. So with this card, if we attend all the visits and collect the stamps, we'll receive some money. How much are you going to receive? $5,300. Rose showed me the card. It was written 500 transport, 2,000 MK for something, 2,800 for something I couldn't read, total 5,300. Also noted was the distance, 4 kilometers, age 22, and Rose's full name. Then Enid said, so you decided to receive the money after delivery? Rose said, yes, I will if I have the chance, but I won't count on it because I hear that some people receive the card, they still never receive any money. Then another girl came wanting to have her hair washed. She was carrying a small baby and I asked if it was her child because the girl looked very young. She said it was her child and I asked her how old she is and she said 16. And how old's the baby? 1 week old. Then Enid said to the girl, are you going to write your final exams? And the girl said, yes, I will. We'll start on the 17th of June. Enid laughed. So your baby came out on time thinking, my mother wants to write her exams. Good baby, and you can leave the child with your mother. What about the husband? I asked. We're not married. I just got pregnant while I was at school. I had a boyfriend and I thought we would get married, but when I told him I was pregnant, he didn't say anything. He doesn't take care of me or the child, only my mother does. Does he at least come to see the child? No, not even that. When I asked the girl where she delivered, she said Adamponda Clinic. I motioned to Rose and asked, did you receive any money after giving birth? She said no, and I asked why. I don't know why. I gave the card to my mother. Maybe she didn't go to receive the money. Then Rose asked Enid to wash her hair. Enid said, do you have money to pay? And Rose said, yes, I do. Enid said, let's wash your hair tomorrow. I want to close quickly today. Rose said, no, my husband's coming to see me. Can you please wash my hair now? Enid said, fine, I'll wash you now. Is he going to spend the night here? Rose said yes, and she looked happy. She'd already bought eggs and tomatoes. She wanted to prepare nice food for him. After washing her hair, we closed up the salon, and as we were ready to leave, the man who gave a child to Enid passed by. Rose started heckling him, shouting, look, he's the one who impregnated Enid, but he ignored the responsibility. He doesn't even take care of the child. He just keeps proposing women. Now that he has money, now that he's working and has money, you girls always accept him, and he doesn't even tell you girls that he has a child. The man was shuffling away quickly, as if he couldn't hear Rose. We were all laughing, even Enid. I hate him, said Enid. We just had sex one time, and I fell pregnant. He ignored me, and I feel the pain because I'm taking care of this child myself, as if I had created her on my own. Why didn't you use a condom to prevent it? I asked. Enid replied, sometimes when you feel love, you don't even think about the consequences, but you start regretting it even before you reach home, and you ask yourself, could I be pregnant? Rose laughed a lot and said, you see, girls, I'm pregnant again because I thought we would get married, but he just comes and goes. He's always making promises, but he doesn't fulfill them. He's told me to look for a house, but he hasn't paid for any house. We all laughed. Enid said, that's men. They all make someone cry. So there's a lot in this story about women's expectations and frustrations with male partners in particular. And the closing line, that's men, they all make someone cry, is pretty interesting. Even as their friend is coming and going with her married, with her married boyfriend from the conversation. And this gives us the opportunity to think about relationship instability and relationship uncertainty, not in terms of the risks of individual marriages, but as a population level phenomenon, right? Something that permeates conversation and that permeates everything. And what I'll show here is something that I think are the TLT data are like uniquely suited for answering, which is the idea that people have, like, what do women think about men? What do they think about most men? Do they think that they are faithful? Well, among the male partners, they said at both points in time, about, almost half of them said, yes, most men are faithful. Among the women, it's far lower, and that number declines as they get older, as the group ages. When we ask whether they think that their own partner has other partners, and I tried to disentangle this between people who know their partner has other partners or people who suspect it, we see very, very few men know or suspect their partner of having other partners. But the women really do. It's sort of close to 40% in 2019 when the women are between 25 and 35 years old. So when we think about this in terms of a population perspective, one of the ways is thinking about how is this distributed, right? Is there a proportion of women who suspect their partners and stay in that state? Are they using that? Is that a way of, or does that begin? So basically, how is that experience, right? Hearing gossip about a partner is another way of thinking about that. When we ask about whether people know or suspect, the proportion seems to be pretty consistent across survey waves and over time. It's not wildly different. But when we look at the proportion of women and men who sort of cycle through that state, like of suspicious, and this is a use of just basically, this is a Cox model used not really to focus on the predictors, but really just to show visually the levels of uncertainty or suspicion in this population, in these samples over the 3-year period of time. There are 2 other like mini analyses that I pursue in the chapter that I won't get into here for the sake of time. One of them is about the role of cell phones in suspicion and relationship uncertainty. And the second is like how people get married and the number of marital steps that they go through and like what does that mean for their relationships. But I want to end with this third example of population chatter, which is which illustrates the experience of men. And this is one of the guards at the TLT research. His name is Patrick. He said it was okay for me to use his photo and his name with a story about a guy that is not him. So let's just be very clear. This is a guy, but this is not the person you're going to hear about in the story. In this story, the men come out looking pretty bad if we're just thinking about, if we're listening to population chatter from the salon and we're looking at these differences in like women's ideas about suspicion and gossip, right? If they've heard someone even talking about their partner in the village. But Patrick gives us a different perspective on this. And so I want to close with this story, which is pretty short because I want to leave time for questions. Basically what happens in this story, we're dealing with 2 of the same people that we saw in the salon, actually 3 of them. So Rose, who was pregnant at the time, has given birth to her second child. The second child is sick and she's at the hospital with the baby. Enid goes to Gertrude's house. In the morning, they're going to visit her at the hospital. They've kind of become a group of friends at this point. In the morning when I woke up, Enid knocked on my door and told me that Rose was over at the hospital with her child and that we needed to go see her before visiting time was over. I said no problem, and we agreed to leave in the afternoon at 4 p.m. On our way, Enid complained that life is a bit tough because she's not working much. She couldn't pay her rent for the salon. The landlord had changed his lock on her kiosk, and she doesn't know when they will let her open it again. These days, she's just braiding people's hair from home. We ran into a man, a friend of Enid, who joined us. He said he wanted to see the child too. Enid introduced the man as Patrick. They had met in Zomba while Enid was visiting her grandparents, and he now stays with relatives in Balaka. So he's not working. Okay. As we were walking, Enid asked Patrick if he's still married, and Patrick said he's not. He added, nowadays, if a man doesn't have money, that means there's no marriage at all. Enid asked Patrick why he would say that. If you have married and you have some money, the woman loves you a lot. But if you don't have money, just know that that marriage is over. There will be no love at all. Patrick says he asked himself why he isn't already dead after having been lied to by so many women. With my first wife, I was doing business and I could find money. I was paying school fees for her when she was in secondary school. I even bathed without soap so that everything could be hers. But then when I started lacking money, she left me for another man. After that one, I fell in love with another woman, but that marriage ended when she started prostituting at our local bar. I asked him, so what's the main reason marriages don't last long these days? The main problem is that women lie, and they say their marriages were in the past. He explained that after his second marriage, he fell in love with another woman whose family brews beer. They were in a relationship. He was in the process of marrying her, and she fell in love with another man who had a big radio that people hire for activities in the community. Even her family preferred the man with the radio because he had more money than me. So I ended that relationship. And I didn't stop there. After that, I fell in love with a girl who was in Form 1. And from my past experiences, I didn't want to send her to school and pay for her education. I just wanted to marry her as quickly as possible. So this one was my fourth wife. After a few months of seeing how we were staying together, how we were getting along, I decided to pay for her school fees. I gave her the school fees, and instead of going to school, she used the money to go to Lilongwe to meet her aunt. After a few days, I called her and I asked her to please come back home. At first, she said she was on her way. She was about to leave. She would depart the next day. Then after calling her for a week, some man answered her phone and warned me not to call that number again. He said, "That girl is now married here in Lilongwe." Enid and I laughed at Patrick's bad luck. He said, "I don't have any appetite for women anymore. They can kill a man. They can also make him poor." By the time we had reached the hospital, we found Rose and her child. The child was recovering, and Rose said they would be leaving the hospital the next morning. We praised God for that and gave Rose the soft drinks I had bought. We didn't stay there long. We just turned around to get home before dark. Then Patrick said he wanted to finish his story. Enid and I laughed and said, "Oh, is there more? Okay, we should give you a chance to finish." Most recently, Patrick's parents found another woman for him to marry. He said that his parents introduced them, and he liked the woman so much that he completely forgot about all the women he had been married to before. She was beautiful and lovely, and within a week we were engaged. Again, he didn't send her to school because he was afraid to repeat those past experiences. Then one day they decided to have a walk at the market. As they were walking, they saw a certain man, and the woman whispered to Patrick, "Do you see the man in front of us? He was my boyfriend before your parents told me about you." The man saw the girl and stopped her. And he said to Patrick, "Stay away from this woman. Know that this girl is beautiful because I'm the one giving her money. Last year she was pregnant and she has my child. And her mother is keeping the grandchild so that this girl has a chance of finding another man to marry as if she were not already a mother." We met at church, we were in the choir, we were singing together, and I ended the relationship when she got pregnant. Now she's given birth and I want her back, so stay away from her. Enid couldn't help laughing at poor Patrick. He said, "Enid, I don't have any appetite or sexual feelings for any women. I have learned a lot of lessons." Patrick and Enid thanked me for letting them join on my walk to the hospital, and I said, "Thanks for keeping me company." Patrick took my phone number and said, "Let's keep chatting." So there's a great line. There are a few great lines in here, right? As the women say about the men, there's a real battle of the sexes aspect to this. You know, they all make someone cry. Patrick says they can kill a man and also make him poor, right? There are interesting things going on with rumors in this story, but the reason that I close with that is to emphasize that women are really showing a lot about relationship uncertainty and articulating that very clearly. But men's concerns are really centered on livelihood uncertainty. Both relationship and uncertainty and livelihood uncertainty affect both women and men. They're both related to HIV into relationships, but they emphasize them differently. So I don't want us to get a different, I didn't want us to come away with the impression that women, that it's this way for the women and not for the men. I think that we have to look at both of these kinds of uncertainty and understanding the full picture for both men and women. I went a minute or two longer than I had intended to, but I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing the slides. So please, any feedback or questions is very, very welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. So this was very, very interesting talk about Balaka. So I know Balaka actually pretty well. I'd like, now we're going to turn to the Q&A part of the talk. And Jerry, you have a question.
First, hi, Jenny. Very good to see you. Very interesting summary of your talk, etc. My question is, you've engaged both in serious ethnographic studies, and you summarize some of those, but also in broader surveys, more of a quantitative sort. And I wondered if what you have learned in the ethnographic studies has informed how you did substantive quantitative studies? And if so, do you have some examples of how?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. Thanks for asking that question, Jerry. I mean, so the slides that I showed about the, knowing or suspecting that your partner has other partners, thinking that having heard gossip about your partner from other people, like in one aspect of my work, I think the ethnographic data really is important for survey construction and the questions that we think to ask. And so those were definitely things that seemed important to me because of things that we learned about how people talked about those things in particular. Another example is thinking about the positive sides of relationships and support. And so in the positive relationships, I mean, in this population chatter, a lot of people are talking about like their complaints about their husbands or their complaints about their wives. But when people are really, really getting along, like what do they say about love? What do they say about that's good in the relationship and how people help one another? And we wrote one survey question that took like a year. It was like a year of ethnographic data. It was probably like, it took forever to write this one question about whether the partner gives you, whether you get help. Not just financial support, but like help with chores and help working in the fields and like support, like that kind of support, which seems to be like a really, really strong, more than anything else, predictor of relationship stability in our sample. So some of it has to do with, so some of it has to do with that. Another part of it is just like thinking about is thinking about the analyses or like which survey items that you trust, in which you have a lot of faith in and are going to do your analyses in. Like one of the things is like that. What do we do about very, very low reports of extramarital sexual partnerships, given what we know from the ethnographic data and from population chatter, right? We know that self-reports are that they're underreported. But what do we do when we compare, 5% prevalence most at the men of saying that they have an extramarital partner to population chatter that sounds like, a lot of people engaging in this behavior, a lot of people covering for other people who are engaging in these kinds of behaviors. I mean, on the one hand, I think that it informs just as much like survey questions that I won't use or like analyses or won't put a lot of weight on. Like I've become much more interested in like trying to think about suspicion and think about suspicion as a driver of behavior, because people do divorce like based on what they hear about what their partners are up to, based on suspicions and based on gossip. This does actually, this does move action. And, whereas I think early on, I thought we would, maybe do more work measuring concurrency and things like that. And that was something that became less interesting to me the more time I spent with the ethnographic data.
Thank you. Daniel Goodkind. Daniel?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just to start, Jenny, I read your essay this morning on demography beyond the foot and PDR. It's really inspiring.
Oh, thanks for saying that.
Demographers are really on the front lines, and your essay reminds us of that. I just had one question. Are consensual unions common in Malawi? I worked on a fertility report in Namibia a few years back, and I was surprised at how common they were there. So that's a category in between never married and first marriage.
Yeah, that's a great thing. I mean, so maybe I'll write to you separately to discuss a little bit more some of these analyses I have about like how married people are. So I tried to distinguish like when people just moved in together versus other kinds of steps in the marital process that they could engage in. And so there's about like 12% of women in our sample who have a partner who they call a husband, right? They just moved in together. They haven't registered with the chief. They have not had a religious ceremony. They haven't had a traditional ceremony with their relatives or registered with the government. Like very few people register their marriages with the government. And so in my in the analyses that I showed you, the first married women are okay, I am counting them as married because they call the person they live with their husband, but they're not, but it might be extremely informal. It's about 12%. So I could think about building that into like the standardization component of this, in addition to like thinking about the different, whether the marital steps are associated with HIV. That gives me an idea for how to proceed. But yeah, it's at least 12% of the young women in our sample.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And unfortunately, it's already 1 o'clock, which is the end of the colloquium. So I myself have a lot of questions for you, but I'll ask you afterwards when we meet at 2 o'clock. So thanks again for presenting at the PSC colloquium, and thanks to the audience attending the talk. So if there are any questions and that have not been answered during your talk, please contact Jenny directly. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jenny.